Sarah's heart raced as she stepped into the bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport. The cold, sterile air of the airport wrapped around her, a stark contrast to the turmoil bubbling inside her. Her fingers gripped the edges of her boarding pass, the edges crinkled from the pressure. Her mind raced, not with excitement, but with a gnawing worry. Toby, her elderly beagle, was sick. Very sick. The vet had promised the test results would be in before her flight, but her phone had been silent. It had been hours. And with every step, she could feel the weight of that silence crushing her. The crowd swirled around her, the typical chaos of an airport, rolling suitcases, hasty voices, and muffled announcements blending together in a blur. But to Sarah, it all felt distant. All she could focus on was the growing knot in her stomach. The soft beep of her phone broke through the noise, but when she glanced down, her stomach dropped. The test results aren't good, Sarah. We need to talk as soon as possible. Her breath caught in her throat. She had known this was coming. She had felt it in her bones the moment Toby had refused food last week. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't break down here, not now, not in front of all these strangers. But as she walked toward the gate, she couldn't help but notice the stares. Not the casual glances of busy travelers, but something else. The way people looked at her, as if she were an inconvenience. An eyesore. She felt it in their gaze. The judgment. It wasn't the first time, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. The world had made it clear that her body didn't fit the standard. She wasn't delicate, she wasn't small, and she certainly wasn't invisible. And today, of all days, she didn't want to be seen. Her eyes darted from one face to another. Some tried to hide their discomfort, pretending to look away as she passed, but others didn't even bother. Their eyes roamed her body, scanning her, dissecting her presence. And just as she prepared to look away, to push past the humiliation, she met the eyes of one woman, a flight attendant. The woman's gaze was cold, calculating. A silent evaluation, as though Sarah's very existence in that space was a problem. A quick jolt of anger surged through Sarah, but she swallowed it down. She had learned long ago not to let these moments control her. She refused to shrink. So, she straightened her shoulders, forced her chin up, and walked toward the boarding gate. But the cold, critical gaze of the flight attendant followed her like a shadow. The judgment was palpable. The uncomfortable silence thickened, pressing against her chest, suffocating. She couldn't escape it. Not now. Not here. As she stepped up to the gate, the attendant didn't even bother to smile. Instead, she looked Sarah up and down once more, her eyes scanning every inch of her body, calculating whether Sarah fit into the neat little box of who deserved to be on this flight. Her lips parted, and Sarah steeled herself, ready for whatever comment would come next. But before the attendant could say a word, another voice broke through the tension, a calm, masculine voice that seemed to cut through the awkward silence. "That's a philosophy I live by too," the voice said. Sarah blinked in surprise, looking up to see a man standing beside her. He was tall, unshaven, with a laid-back air about him. He wasn't particularly striking, but there was something about him, something genuine. He smiled at her, not mockingly, but with a warmth that caught her off guard. His eyes were kind, understanding. For a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. It was only a fleeting moment, but Sarah felt something shift. Maybe it was the unexpected kindness, or maybe it was the fact that, for a second, she didn't feel so alone. But as quickly as he appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. The familiar sting of judgment crept back into her chest. But this time, it wasn't just her imagination. The flight attendant's cold stare was back. And this time, it felt worse. "Is this really your seat?" The attendant's voice was saccharine sweet, dripping with condescension. Sarah looked down at her boarding pass, her heart sinking. She was in the right seat. She knew that. But the way the attendant asked, as though it were some mistake, made Sarah feel small. The gaze that followed her as she stepped past the attendant was one she'd felt too many times before. It was a look that said, "You don't belong here." As she settled into her seat, she tried to push the words out of her head. She couldn't let them win. She wouldn't. But as she buckled in, the reality of the situation sank in. She was trapped. Not just by the walls of the airplane, but by the expectations of a society that had already written her off. And there, in that seat, she wasn't sure how long she could keep fighting it. Sarah sat in her seat, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to echo in her mind, but they wouldn't let go. Her hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. The plane was still boarding, passengers walking down the aisle, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that every single one of them was judging her. Every step she took, every glance thrown her way, felt like a silent interrogation. The low hum of the engines was drowned out by the noise in her head. The flight attendant, the one with the cold eyes, was still standing by the aisle, watching. Sarah couldn't look at her directly, but she could feel the eyes on her like a spotlight, cold and piercing. The woman didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, observing. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to shout, to tell the woman to stop looking at her like she was some kind of monster. But she didn't. She couldn't. She glanced over at the man seated beside her. He was a middle-aged businessman, graying hair, glasses, impeccably dressed. He had barely acknowledged her as she sat down, his attention fixed on his laptop. His eyes never lifted from the screen, but she could feel the discomfort radiating from him. She could almost hear the thoughts running through his head. How did someone like her end up on this flight? She hated that she knew exactly what he was thinking. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, but it wasn't from the vet. It was just a reminder about her flight. A low hum of disappointment buzzed in her chest. She shoved the phone back into her bag, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. She couldn't let herself fall apart. Not here. Not now. But just as she was trying to steady her breath, another voice interrupted the silent tension. "Oh sweetheart, is this really your seat?" Sarah froze, the words cutting through the quiet of the cabin. She looked up, meeting the flight attendant's eyes. Her smile was so fake, it made Sarah's stomach twist. The woman's gaze swept over her again, slow and deliberate, as if she were inspecting an object she had no use for. Sarah glanced down at her boarding pass, her fingers trembling slightly as she confirmed her seat number once more. 22B, it was the right seat. She had double-checked, triple-checked even before getting on the plane. But the way the attendant said it, the way she dragged out the question, made Sarah feel like she was in the wrong. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. "I'm in the right seat." The flight attendant's smile didn't waver. It was the same tight, forced smile she had worn since Sarah had stepped onto the plane. But there was something in the way her eyes glinted. Satisfaction. "If you need more space, I can try to find a more appropriate seat," she said, almost too sweetly. "But of course, that comes at a cost." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She felt her face flush, her heart pounding. The woman wasn't offering help. She wasn't concerned about Sarah's comfort. This wasn't about finding a better seat, this was about humiliation. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. She wanted to say something, to call the woman out, but what good would it do? The whole plane was watching. The passengers were pretending to ignore the exchange, but she could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to falter, to lose her composure. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen. Her gaze flickered to the side, where she spotted the man from earlier, the one who had complimented her t-shirt. He was walking down the aisle, heading toward first class. Their eyes met for just a moment, a fleeting glance, but something about it made her breath catch. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment. Just a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of acknowledgement. And then, just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd moving toward the front of the plane. Sarah took a deep breath, her chest tight with the weight of the moment. She wasn't going to let this woman get the best of her. She wasn't going to let her feel small. Not again. With a tight smile, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the attendant. "I'm fine with my seat," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." She didn't wait for the woman's response. Instead, she turned, ignoring the woman's eyes burning into the back of her head, and walked to her seat. But as she slid into the cramped space, something in her stomach twisted painfully. The man beside her, the one with the glasses and the suit, looked at her, his eyes darting to the seat beside her before quickly looking away. He was moving. He was standing. He was changing seats. Sarah's heart sank as the man shuffled past her, his face flushed with discomfort. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at her. He just walked away, taking his laptop and bag with him, leaving her sitting alone, exposed. It wasn't just him. Other passengers glanced at her, some with pity, others with discomfort. It was all too familiar. But this time, Sarah didn't shrink. She refused to let them see her crumble. Not today. She clenched her jaw and took a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to ignore the sting in her chest. She wasn't going to let this woman or anyone else make her feel like she didn't belong. She wasn't going to let them see her weak. She wouldn't. Not today. The flight attendants began to prepare for the in-flight service, their voices cutting through the silence of the cabin. The hum of the engines grew louder, and Sarah tried to drown out the noise in her head. She reached for her book, hoping it would distract her, but the words blurred on the page. Every rustle of the cart, every polite smile from the attendants, felt like a spotlight on her, a reminder that she was still different, still not quite right. She glanced around the cabin, hoping no one else would notice her discomfort. The man who had switched seats, the businessman, was sitting further up now, his eyes still fixed firmly on his laptop. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling the same way she was. Did he feel awkward, uncomfortable in the tight quarters? Or was it just her, the one who never seemed to fit anywhere? The flight attendant, the one who had been so cold to her earlier, stopped by her row. Her smile was too wide, too forced. "Can I offer you something to drink?" she asked, her tone dripping with sweetness, but Sarah could hear the subtle edge beneath it. "No, thank you," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. She was tired of being treated like a problem to be dealt with, a nuisance. She didn't need her pity or her fake kindness. The attendant's eyes narrowed just slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she moved on, gliding away like a ghost. Sarah exhaled, not realizing she had been holding her breath. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Sarah could feel the weight of every stare, every uncomfortable shift in seat, every glance that lingered just a second too long. Her stomach churned with unease. The flight had barely started, and already, she felt like she was suffocating. But then, something unexpected happened. The man from earlier, the one who had complimented her shirt, suddenly appeared at the front of the cabin, walking toward her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Why was he coming over? She didn't know if she was ready for another uncomfortable interaction, especially after the way things had gone so far. As he passed by, their eyes met, and for a second, she could have sworn he was about to say something. Instead, he glanced at the seat beside her. His gaze flicked to the flight attendant who had been so rude to Sarah, and then back to Sarah. There was something in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, of understanding. Without a word, he continued down the aisle. It was such a small moment, but it was enough to make Sarah pause. Something about the way he had looked at her made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shift the heavy weight pressing down on her chest. But before she could process what had just happened, the flight attendant was back, standing beside her once more. Sarah's heart sank. "Excuse me, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "I think your seatmate might need a little more space." Sarah's face flushed, a surge of anger rushing through her. Was this really happening again? Was the woman trying to make her feel small, trying to make her feel like she didn't belong in the space she was occupying? The words hung in the air, thick with judgment. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the eyes of the passengers around her on her again, their discomfort palpable. It wasn't just the flight attendant now. It was everyone. Everyone was watching. Waiting. To see how she would respond. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell the woman exactly where she could go. But something held her back. Maybe it was the weight of the situation, or maybe it was the quiet, unspoken expectation that she would just take it, that she would shrink back into herself and allow them to push her down. Instead, Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let this woman break her. Not again. Not this time. "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "I'm fine right here." The attendant's smile wavered just slightly, but she didn't argue. She simply turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor like the sound of a clock ticking away the seconds. Sarah sat there for a moment, her chest tight, her hands gripping the armrests. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but she didn't dare look up. She couldn't. She just wanted to disappear. To melt into the seat and never be seen again. But then, she heard it. The sound of footsteps approaching. Sarah looked up in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. It was him. The man. Keanu Reeves. He was standing in front of her, his eyes soft but determined. There was no mistaking the authority in his voice when he spoke. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that made the air around them shift. For a moment, everything froze. The plane seemed to hold its breath. The flight attendant stopped dead in her tracks, her face going pale. The passengers around them began to murmur, their whispers like a ripple through the cabin. Sarah's heart raced, her breath coming in short gasps. She couldn't believe what was happening. Keanu's eyes never left the flight attendant. "What exactly is the problem here?" he asked again, his voice firm, commanding. The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was stunned. She hadn't expected this. Sarah could see the panic flash in her eyes as the truth of the situation hit her. Keanu didn't wait for her to speak. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but sincere. Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. For the first time on this flight, she felt seen. Keanu didn't look back at the attendant. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the other passengers, silently telling them all that he was on her side. And just like that, Sarah wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't invisible. Not to him. Not anymore. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence heavy with anticipation. Keanu stood there for a moment, his gaze steady on the flight attendant, as if daring her to challenge him. The atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, once indifferent, were now watching intently. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but this time, it was different. There was no pity in their stares, no judgment, just a quiet understanding. For the first time since boarding, she didn't feel like a spectacle. She didn't feel like the outsider. The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she muttered, her voice faltering under the weight of Keanu's unyielding presence. Keanu's eyes never left hers. "Does your job include humiliating passengers?" His voice was calm, but it sliced through the air like a sharp blade. The woman's face flushed a deep crimson. She stammered, trying to find some excuse, but Keanu wasn't giving her the chance. His gaze softened slightly as he turned back to Sarah. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now, as though he truly cared about her response. Sarah swallowed hard, still in shock. She wasn't used to being treated like this, not like a person who mattered, not like someone worth standing up for. She had been invisible for so long. But now, with Keanu standing there, with the eyes of the cabin upon them, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was the realization that she didn't have to be silent anymore. I'm okay," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly, but steady enough. She felt the lump in her throat start to loosen, the weight on her chest begin to lift. She wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who saw the wrongness in this moment. Keanu nodded, giving her a small smile, and then turned back to the flight attendant. "I think there's been a mistake with the seating arrangements," he said, his words deliberate, his tone unbothered, like this was just another normal conversation. The flight attendant's face tightened, but she didn't speak. Keanu continued, "I believe my seat is next to hers. Please, take a look." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Keanu moved past the flight attendant, walking toward Sarah's seat. Sarah's heart raced. What was he doing? Why was he doing this? But she didn't have time to think it through before Keanu was standing right there, looking down at her with that same gentle smile. Without waiting for her to respond, Keanu simply slid into the seat next to hers. It was a bold, public move. A statement that couldn't be ignored. The flight attendant was frozen in place, her eyes wide, her expression a mixture of disbelief and rage. She opened her mouth to protest, but Keanu raised a hand, silencing her. "You see," he said softly, "there's been a mistake. I'll be staying here for the rest of the flight." The silence in the cabin was deafening. The passengers, who had been pretending to mind their own business, were now watching the exchange with rapt attention. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares, but this time, it didn't make her feel small. It didn't make her want to disappear. This time, she felt like the center of something bigger. Like she was witnessing the world change around her. The flight attendant didn't know how to respond. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. It was as though the power she had held over Sarah, over all the passengers, had evaporated in the face of Keanu's calm authority. Finally, the attendant turned, walking down the aisle with as much dignity as she could muster, but the damage was done. Sarah could hear the murmurs of the passengers around her, their whispers rising like a wave. It wasn't just Sarah who had witnessed the injustice anymore. It was everyone. Everyone had seen how unfairly she had been treated, and now they knew the truth. Keanu leaned back in his seat, adjusting his bag, and picking up his book as if nothing had happened. But Sarah couldn't take her eyes off him. She was still processing everything that had just occurred. The man who had once seemed like a stranger had just turned into a hero. Not with grand gestures or flashy words, but with one simple, decisive action. He had stood up for her, and in doing so, had made the entire cabin, the entire flight, take notice. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she had boarded the plane. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't just the woman who didn't fit in. She was a person. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she mattered. Keanu glanced over at her, his eyes meeting hers once again. There was no pity there, no judgment, just quiet understanding. And for that, Sarah felt something shift deep inside. Maybe she didn't have to keep shrinking. Maybe she could start taking up space. She smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the plane, she didn't feel so alone. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The tension that had gripped the air earlier was gone, replaced by a strange sense of solidarity. Sarah felt it in the way the passengers no longer avoided her gaze. Some even smiled at her, subtly nodding in recognition of what had just transpired. The whispers that once carried judgment now seemed to be filled with curiosity, admiration even. She could hear snippets of conversations around her, hushed and respectful. People were talking about what had happened, but they were no longer looking at her with pity. They were looking at her with a kind of quiet respect. Sarah sat there, stunned. She couldn't quite wrap her head around it. A part of her still felt like she was floating outside of the situation, unsure of what had just unfolded. But as she glanced over at Keanu, who was still calmly flipping through his book, she realized that what had happened wasn't just about him coming to her defense. It was about something larger, something more important. It was about standing up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of something they had no control over. Keanu didn't look at her again, but there was something in his presence that made her feel grounded. He wasn't doing this for attention. He wasn't doing this for fame or accolades. He was doing this because it was the right thing to do. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt like she had been seen. Not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as a person worthy of respect. When the meal service came, the flight attendants moved with an air of forced professionalism. The one who had humiliated Sarah earlier barely glanced her way. Her face was a mask of strained politeness, and Sarah could see the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes. The other attendants, the ones who had been quietly observing, acted as though nothing had happened, but the shift was obvious. There was a quiet, shared understanding now. A respect that had been earned, not through force, but through the simple act of standing up for what was right. The man who had switched seats with her, the businessman who had left in discomfort, was now seated a few rows ahead. Sarah hadn't seen him move, but she could tell from his stiff posture and the way he kept glancing back at her that he was still wrestling with his own discomfort. But that wasn't her problem. Not anymore. She had a seat at the table now, not just physically, but emotionally. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small. As the plane finally began its descent into their destination, Sarah took a deep breath and looked out the window. The city below was a blur of lights, but for the first time, she felt like she was looking at it through new eyes. She had been invisible for so long, she had allowed the weight of society's expectations to swallow her. But today, something had shifted. Something inside her had changed. And she couldn't go back to the person she had been before. The plane touched down, and the usual chaos of disembarking began. Passengers shuffled in the aisles, gathering their belongings. Sarah stood up slowly, taking a moment to steady herself, to feel the ground beneath her feet. She looked around at the faces of the other passengers, and for the first time, she didn't feel their judgment. They weren't looking at her with the same discomfort they had before. They weren't pretending she didn't exist. As she reached the gate, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd. A small group of passengers had gathered around their phones, watching something intently. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of dread creeping in. But before she could wonder what was happening, someone whispered, "It's on Twitter. Keanu Reeves, the guy from the flight." Sarah's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask. She knew. The video. Someone had recorded it. Someone had filmed everything, the moment Keanu had stepped in, the confrontation, the seat switch. It had all been captured. Her hand shook as she pulled her phone from her bag. She unlocked it, her fingers trembling, and there it was. The video, already viral. The caption read, "Keanu Reeves stands up for a passenger bullied by flight attendant. #respect #kindness." Sarah's eyes went wide. The video was everywhere. People were watching it. Commenting. Sharing. She couldn't bring herself to watch the whole thing, but just from the first few seconds, she could hear the crowd's reaction, the whispers that had gone from confusion to awe. Her chest tightened, and she realized, with a rush, that the world had just seen her. Not as an object of ridicule, but as someone worth standing up for. The plane landed, and Sarah stood there, holding her suitcase, still processing what had just happened. She could feel the weight of the world shift. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had been humiliated on that flight. She was part of something bigger. Part of a conversation that was happening, not just in the confines of the airplane, but in the world outside. As she walked toward the exit, she caught sight of Keanu once more. He was already heading toward the gate, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But it was extraordinary. What he had done, what they had all witnessed, wasn't just a small act of kindness. It was a reminder of what it meant to stand up, not just for yourself, but for others. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart light, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of peace. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was heard. And for the first time, she felt truly free.